Indirect talks between the United States and Iran are due to begin in Geneva, aimed at restricting Tehran's nuclear program. With little sign of compromise, the US is also continuing its military buildup in the Gulf region, preparing for weeks of possible military action against Tehran. That's according to US officials cited by the Reuters news agency. Ahead of today's talks, Iranian state media say the country's Revolutionary Guard is holding military drills in the Strait of Hormuz. Hardline politicians in Iran have repeatedly threatened to block the strait if attacked. Nearly 20% of global oil shipments pass through the waterway. US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will take part in today's negotiations in Switzerland, and so, apparently, will the president.
So I'll be involved in those talks indirectly, and they'll be very important. We'll see what can happen. It's been typically, Iran's a very tough negotiator. They're good negotiators, or bad negotiators. I would say they're bad negotiators because we could have had a deal instead of sending the B-2s in to knock out their nuclear potential, and we had to send the B-2s. I hope they're going to be more reasonable. They want to make a deal.
Have you been told that a deal is next to impossible?
No, I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal. They want to make a deal.
Well, Farzan Sabet is an Iran expert and nuclear security researcher at the Global Governance Center in Geneva. Welcome to DW. Let's start with the warning we heard from the president. What sort of consequences is Iran likely to face if they don't make a deal?
Oh, thanks for having me on. So, of course, we're looking at different potential military scenarios. One is a one-off strike that would probably be both materially meaningful and symbolically significant. For example, decapitating senior political and security leadership while also degrading some aspects of Iran's military capabilities. Of course, with some of the reporting that we've seen, including the Reuters piece that you cited, the U.S. is also considering something far larger. For example, a limited war, which in terms of both its scale and impact could be comparable to the 12-day war that we saw this past summer, or going slightly beyond that.
Meanwhile, there are reports that Iran's Revolutionary Guard is holding military drills in the Strait of Hormuz. Should that be interpreted as their counter-threat?
Certainly. That's definitely the case. Of course, for the Islamic Republic to make threats that it will, for example, disrupt the global energy trade that passes through the Strait of Hormuz, it costs them nothing. Of course, the reality is that if they do escalate to that level, attempting to disrupt the energy trade as well as striking the energy infrastructure of neighboring countries, they risk expanding what might have been a one-off strike or a limited war to a far larger conflict that also involves neighboring countries. So while there is a risk of miscalculations and the Iranians doing there are also, I think, important factors in place that could restrain their response should a conflict break out.
OK, so are we essentially looking at posturing with there being more likelihood of the Americans following through with their threats than the Iranians?
Of course, the Iranians will feel compelled to give some form of response, especially given that in previous rounds of conflicts, they've very, very much constrained themselves. But yes, that's indeed the case. The U.S. strike, I think, is likely to be on the higher side in terms of its impact, while the Iranians will feel compelled to respond, but perhaps not as in large a scale as they've been gesturing.
Are both sides now clear on what they're talking about? Because at one stage it was just the uranium enrichment that Iran wanted to talk about. The United States seems to want to talk about that and other military things. So are they do both sides think they're negotiating about the same things?
That's a very good question. We're not in the room and we can't say for certain. What we can very clearly see is that what Iran is talking about is a narrow nuclear deal, focusing only on some aspect of its nuclear program, and it's demanding sanctions really in exchange. While the U.S., it's been all over the place. It's talked about everything from a nuclear deal all the way up to regime change. And what we've seen more often from the U.S. is a demand for a comprehensive deal that would cover not only the nuclear issue, but also the missile issue and the proxy issue. What we might come down to is kind of a negotiation that does focus on the nuclear issue specifically, but more broadly than the Iranians have been signaling so far.
Okay, good talking to you. Thanks for talking us through that, Farzan. Farzan Sabet from the Global Governance Centre.
Thanks for having me on.